Hi, everyone. This is week 4, and we are talking about power and how that affects our personal positions. Uh, this is an important week and kind of sets the stage for how we evaluate a lot of the weeks coming up. And it ties in really well to last week's on social construction of reality. So, if we remember last week, we're talking about the sociology of culture as a way of creating the world around us, specifically the meanings that everything has and how we interact with the world. Um, Easy examples are like for a table. If we see a table, we culturally have placed meaning on this piece of wood that has, you know, legs and a flat surface on what to do with a table, how to interact with the table, um, in which situations it's okay to sit on the table itself, or which situations you should sit on the floor next to the table, or when you should, sit on a chair next to the table. These are all different meanings that we've put on the table itself, and the how we understand what a table to be. This gets even more complicated when we look at humans and anything social. So remember, culture is created by constructing our reality, and construction means, taking these meanings, these signs, these actions, these beliefs, these values, and institutionalizing them into our daily lives to the point where we accept them as reality, as normal, objective, and natural. But we haven't gotten into power. So, this is something, think about with Durkheim. He said that anything that is out of the norm is crime, but he never talked about who gets, is there a difference in who gets to define what crime is, or who is, um, are there groups that have more social sway over others in determining what is normal, right? And so thinking of power really helps us make sense of a lot of the things going on in the world and history. Um, Probably one of the first social theorists to really hone in on power as an idea was Max Weber. He had a couple of ideas of what power was, and this your textbook goes over this a little bit. Power is simply, in his idea, the ability to influence other people, to make them do things they otherwise wouldn't do. For example, there's not much of an ability to make someone eat, since that's something that people would normally do. But making them, work to eat might be something they wouldn't otherwise do, or work a particular job. Authority is a form of power. It is the likelihood that a command will be obeyed among a group of persons, and legitimate authority is when people obey commands without any threats or actual force. Um, so this is uh, someone who goes to church and the pope, the priest, the prophet, or whoever says we should do this thing, and the people do that thing because they think or believe that the church leader has authority and is doing God's will. Another one would be if you are in the military and your commander in chief says we are going to war, and you go to war without any threats or your commander saying you have to go. You're like, well, this is time for war, let's go. That would be a case of legitimate authority where commands are being obeyed without any force or threats of force. Now, this is still a little bit separated from the power that or the idea that we've been talking about in terms of constructing our world. And there have been scholars who have really thought about how can power actually influence the way we believe the world is. Marx and Engels actually, so Engels was Marx's writing companion. They published a lot together. Um, Engels especially pushed this idea that when the ruling class, and remember, Marx and Engels believed that economic systems throughout history have been divided into who has and who has not. And so the people that own or the people that have are the ruling class, that when they are in power, they establish ideas and values that legitimate their position in power, right? So if a king is in power, often kings were or kingdoms would have a belief that God has chosen that king to lead that country or those people, and so they would use the ideals and values to reinforce or legitimate their position in power. And this often creates a false consciousness of why people are in different classes. For example, in this kingdom example, the serfs or the peasants might be told, "You are a part of this kingdom. God has chosen this leader and these rulers, but you are an important part in your labor. So keep working." And they might believe that it is a legitimate hierarchy, that God has chosen this king, and thus he should be king, even if he does terrible things. In capitalism, we see similar things today. That, for example, the belief that um, wealthy people are those who work the hardest. And this makes some people believe that people in poverty just don't work hard enough, and that's why they're in poverty. And even many people in poverty believe these ideals. So this creates a false consciousness, because I think most of us know, if we have lived in poverty or know people who have lived in poverty, this is it's almost the opposite, that most people in poverty are working very hard just to survive, right? So the ruling class of wealth is earned, wealth is only for those who have worked hard. It creates a false consciousness among people with the idea that all I got to do is work even harder and then I'll make it too. Gramsci and Foucault gave similar ideas building off of Marx and Engels. Antonio Gramsci was a political theorist who was imprisoned by Mussolini during the early 1900s, and he wrote a lot while he was in prison, especially on the idea of hegemony. Hegemony is the idea that not only is there a ruling class, but the ruling class enforces its power in two ways. One is through coercion. So this is kind of like illegitimate authority for Weber, right? The force, they make you do things. And then the other is through consensus, the idea that they will create propaganda or they'll like influence cultural ideas to make the people that they rule over accept a reality that legitimates the ruling class. So this could be through the media, this could be through explicit propaganda. We see a little bit of this in Russia right now with the invasion of Ukraine. When there have been journalists or protesters in Russia, there's been the coercion where they've either arrested or, that person disappeared, right? or killed, or any dissension from the idea that Russia should be in Ukraine has been coerced out. And then the propaganda machine of Russia has worked a consensus throughout the people of Russia, the idea that they have a legitimate reason to go into Ukraine, to fight Ukraine, and to take it over. So they've manufactured consent within the Russian populace. Foucault's is a little bit more difficult, and I'm not going to touch it extremely. I just wanted to give these ideas to show you that the power, there is a very important idea of power that helps us construct the way we view the world and accept the reality, even if that reality is constructed by people in power. And this is this helps us introduce what we're about to talk about with race and gender. So let's look about, this is a video that's going to overview how race has been a construct and has changed throughout time depending on who is in power and why. So let's watch a little bit of this.
You may think you know exactly what race you are, but how would you prove it if someone disagreed with you? The fact is, even though race drives a lot of social and political outcomes, race isn't real. One of the first people to attempt to categorize humans according to race was a German scientist around 1776. He came up with 5 different groups according to physical appearance and geographic origin of their ancestors. Americans of European descent eagerly bought into this type of thinking around the same time. Some historians have said the idea that there were different races helped them resolve the contradiction between a natural right to freedom and the fact of slavery. If whites were their own distinct category, then they could feel a lot better about denying freedom to people who they labeled black and decided were fundamentally different. But as political priorities change, definitions of race in America adjust right along with them. For example, if you were of Mexican birth or ancestry in the United States in 1929, you were considered white. Then, the 1930 census changed that to non-white to limit immigration. Later, when the U.S. needed to increase its labor force during World War II, these people were switched back to white. And what it took to be black once varied so wildly throughout the country, from 1/4 to 1/16 to the infamous 1 drop of African ancestry, that people could actually change races just by crossing state lines. Then, suddenly, in 2000, the government decided that Americans could be more than one race and added a multiracial category to the census. This has left many Americans scratching their heads when it comes to selecting who they are. As many as 6.2% of census respondents selected some other race in a 2010 survey. The idea that someone might look one way and identify another way, or that they might be really hard to place in a racial category, is not new. This is why there was a public debate about whether MSNBC's Karen Finney could say she was black, or how we can't even agree on the racial label assigned to the President of the United States. Of course, many people feel their racial identity is very clear and very permanent, but the fact that some people have changed theirs and that no one can really argue with them shows how shaky the very idea of race is. This is all because there isn't a race chromosome in our DNA that people can point to. It simply doesn't exist. When the medical community links race to health outcomes, it's really just using race as a substitute for other factors, such as where your ancestors came from, or the experiences of people who may have been put in the same racial group as you. Dorothy Roberts explains that sickle cell anemia is a prime example of this. The disease is linked to areas with high rates of malaria, which include some parts of Europe and Asia in addition to Africa. It's not actually about race at all. This, of course, does not mean that the concept of race isn't hugely important in our lives. The racial categories to which we're assigned can determine real-life experiences, they can drive political outcomes, and they can even make the difference between life and death. But understanding that racial categories are made up can give us an important perspective on where racism came from in the first place.
Okay, so what that video was going through was the ways racial categories have changed based on political needs, right? They talk about how Mexican immigrants were deemed white or not white, depending on whether or not the U.S. wanted immigrants to be in the labor force. It talks about how they created the idea of the 1 drop rule. That meant that if you have just 1 drop of African blood, then you are suddenly African. And we will learn later on in the course how this was the opposite for Native Americans, where for Native Americans, you needed full blood in order to claim Native American status, and that if you had, only 3/4 or half or 1/4 of Native American blood, then you would be pushed out of the community or seen as not Native enough. So race has always been this kind of construct that we've created to try to organize the world, but has largely been done by people in power to legitimate certain practices, whether that's taking indigenous land, whether that's legitimizing slavery. Racial categories have been created largely by people in power simply to keep structures of class and status in stable, right? And this similarly can be tied to gender. So we're going to again go to a video where we talk about gender.
Gender identity might be one of the most polarizing conversations that's happening on social media right now. In most countries, sex is defined as what you're physically born as, male or female. But gender identity can be much more fluid. A person can be born female and feel more comfortable or identify as male, or vice versa. I've been seeing a lot of young people all over the world from gender fluid societies talking about their traditions online. This is Geronimo from the Native American Navajo community in New Mexico.
She'e Francis Geronimo Louis, and I am Chiricahua Apache born for Diné. I identify as a two-spirit individual. This is my backyard. Just a lot of trees, lots of cactus. There's some mountains over there.
Geronimo identifies as one of the 4 sacred and ancient gender identities from his culture.
We have masculine, 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 feminine, 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 masculine. Masculine, feminine is something that I gravitate towards both spiritually, mentally, physically, and emotionally. The word for masculine, feminine is nakle, someone who is male-bodied, has a feminine nature, or who also takes on the roles of a woman and man. I take it quite literally sometimes. I can dress as a female, I can dress as a male. And traditionally, you're supposed to tie up your hair in a tiel. So men's traditionally would be right here, and women's traditionally we would be somewhere up here. We wear bandanas. I know that I'm a male, and I can take on the gender roles of a female. I weave, I cook, I clean.
8,000 miles away in India's capital, Delhi, gender has been more than just male and female for centuries.
Hi, Namaste. I am Leher. I am 23 and I was not born in a female body.
In 2014, the Supreme Court recognized a third gender.
I was assigned sex male at birth and I changed my gender medically. However, I'm not what in the Western terminologies you would call a trans woman or a transgender. In India, we're considered third gender or the sacred gender that has the power to bless or to curse. We're regarded as highly sacred and respectable. Gender has never been binary in India. It's always been very, very fluid, especially in Indian mythologies. We have scriptures that describe more than 20 to 28 genders. We have story of Shikhandi. Shikhandi was assigned female at birth. However, the person transformed themselves into a man to fight the battle of Mahabharata.
Over in Australia, transgender people have had different names among Aboriginal communities. Kai identifies as a brother boy.
So a brother boy is a person that's been born female but has a male spirit or masculine spirit.
Our understanding of being is so much more than a scientific definition of what is XX chromosome or XY chromosome. We can coexist, but doesn't mean that you should perpetrate hate and violence onto people that don't necessarily believe in the way that you believe.
However, Kai's journey hasn't been easy, as he still faces discrimination in his own community.
As someone that was born a woman and done women's stuff, and then transitioning into a man, you know, it's quite difficult at times to find your place as a person within my culture. And I think, yeah, I'm still on that journey.
And for many communities, the history of gender fluidity was lost with colonialism.
Sister girls and brother boys history is difficult to document because of the effect of colonization. There's been a lot of shame and stigma.
Pre-colonialism time, gender roles were actually widely accepted amongst my people and our tribe. These individuals who were called Two-Spirit were widely respected when colonialism started to happen. A lot of our people died and were murdered, and so a lot of the teachings and understandings of these people were lost. Forced assimilation, religious conversion all contributed to the idea that Two-Spirit individuals were bad people and they needed to go away. I face a lot of discrimination. It hurts my feelings
Leher also believes that colonization has meant there's less acceptance of gender diversity in India.
Colonization is what has corrupted the mindsets of Indian folks that today are maybe transphobic or homophobic.
Increasingly, the question of gender identity is becoming much more than how you choose to self-identify. It can decide whether or not you can access biologically divided spaces like toilets and aid shelters, and some sports. But the question of who should have access to these spaces is one of the reasons why questions over gender has become so polarised in Western society. Yet some people question the idea of gender and believe stereotyped ideas around masculinity and femininity are limiting. And in some other parts of the world, the idea of just male and female have been seen as an oversimplification.
So here we see that in many, especially indigenous communities around the world, there was quite an expansive view of gender, whether this was a combination of different kinds of like physical sex characteristics and then different genders. So we saw this in the masculine, feminine indigenous person from New Mexico who said he was born a man, but he like identifies with feminine characteristics a lot, whether it is something more, outside of that binary. And as we heard at the end of this clip, colonialism was largely one of the pressures to enforce a binary, to differentiate between men and women and only men and women and not allow anything outside of that. There is a piece that I used to have students read. It's really complicated. But one of the things they talked about was how the enforcement of a gender binary in Africa was largely done, similar to race, to justify why colonialists could go in and say they were better. Is that if these people weren't adhering to a gender binary, then they were seen as savages. And in order for any people from those communities to be treated with respect by colonialists, they needed to adopt the strict gender binary, as well as things like Christianity and other social constructs. So if gender is something constructed, then we should look at why has it been constructed this way, and what benefit does it give the people who constructed it, and continue to construct it, right? And so hopefully looking at it this way with race and gender, we see that our reality is, even if there is, skin color, even if there are physical characteristics that differ between two groups of people like male and female, that the understanding and the approach to those things like race and gender are constructed through social interactions and through power. To help us with this, we are going to go into thinking about the matrix of domination. This was coined by Patricia Hill Collins. She is a professor of sociology at Brandeis. She works a lot in the space of Black females, Black feminism, the intersections of race, gender, class, and just a lot. So what you read this week is a portion from Black Feminist Thought, which she wrote in 1990, and it's describing the matrix of domination. Setting up to get into how does she understand the matrix of domination, she looks at how over time, worldviews and frameworks have looked at specifically white men as the normal, and seeing how other people deviate from those white men. And what she wants to do is put Black women at the center and say, what if we take Black women's experiences as the basis for our investigation, see how everyone else diverges from that experience. And through this, she says, we can understand how power is working in a lot of different ways. This builds on something similar to W.E.B. Du Bois, who said that when you look at the or when you have the veil that covers power relations, those who are being oppressed are able to better see these systems of oppression. Similarly, um, what's her name? Anna Cooper addressed this with her standpoint idea that women have a standpoint because they are away from the mess of the politics, that they're able to give a better, description of what's happening there. Collins is building off of a lot of these ideas and saying that when we look at people who are being affected by systems of oppression, it allows us to better diagnose and analyze those systems. So if we put in one overarching idea to what Collins is saying, it's the matrix of domination is the interlocking axes or systems of oppression, and they need each other to function. And you can't understand one without understanding the other. One way of thinking about this is looking at the additive model of oppression. And this is kind of similar to if you've ever seen those videos where they would have everyone line up and then they'd read a statement, and people with privilege would step forward, people without privilege would step back. This is an example that BuzzFeed did when one of the questions was, if you can show affection for your romantic partner in public without fear of ridicule and violence, take one step forward, right? So this would be saying heterosexuals have privilege in society, whereas homosexuals or queer folk have less privilege. This is called the additive model of oppression. The idea that every identity you have that is quote unquote oppressed just adds on. And so you probably have heard the idea of oppression Olympics, where people can say, well, I have more oppression than you. And Collins is saying that's not how it works. What she's saying is all of these axes of oppression that we commonly talk about, like class, race, gender, politics, religion, nationality, colonial status, right? Citizenship. All of these aren't just added oppressions, but they intersect with each other and fundamentally alter the categories in which you reside. So one way of thinking about this is, if you look at today, do the experiences of women who live in poor white communities match the experience of women in poor black communities or in wealthy white communities, right? So to be and experience femininity changes based on your class, changes based on your race, changes based on your location. And we saw this in what Cooper talked about when she said she was at a train station. She saw a sign that said restroom for ladies and restroom for colored people. And she's like, well, what am I? There is no restroom for colored women. And so her experience as a woman was fundamentally changed by her race, and her experience as a black person was fundamentally changed by her gender. You can't just say, oh, she's a black woman, so she has these two oppressions. But the idea of female and the idea of black were both altered because of their intersection. And that's what she's trying to say, is that all of these oppressions interlocked in fundamental ways and changed the experiences. But also that each oppression that each of us are not all oppressed or all privileged, but that we have different areas. So instead of just like two binaries of oppressed and privileged, there's a spectrum on that, and we all fall within different spots. She describes there are 3 levels of this matrix of domination where experience of oppression and resistance lie. And let's go through those quickly. So first is personal biography, that social ties can be both empowering and confining. And this is where the dominant group tries to challenge or change our consciousness of how we perceive and interact with the world. But it's also our individual consciousness where we deviate from that is the site of new knowledges, and she argues where change can begin. At the cultural or community level, she's saying that most people have stable cultural contexts, and this is a history, a geography, a social institution that create the knowledge shared within that culture, and but there will always be competition between the dominant knowledges, right, the stable cultural context, and the subjugated knowledges. She writes, I'm going to quote specifically from her and see if you can understand where she's pulling this idea of the community level of domination. While efforts to influence this dimension of the oppressed group's experiences can be partially successful, this level is more difficult to control than dominant groups would have us believe. For example, adhering to externally derived standards of beauty leads many African American women to dislike their skin color or hair texture. Similarly, internalizing Eurocentric gender ideology leads some Black men to abuse Black women. These are the cases of successful infusion of the dominant group's specialized thought into the everyday cultural context of African Americans. But the long-standing existence of a Black woman's culture resistance, as expressed through Black women's relationships with one another, the Black woman's blues tradition, and the voices of contemporary African American women writers, all attest to the difficulty of eliminating the cultural context as a fundamental site of resistance. So despite all of these norms that have been infused in African American women culture, the fact that they continue resisting shows that it is impossible to eliminate resistance. Finally, she looks at the structural level, so this can be seen as the macro level, and that institutions are exposing and enforcing the dominant group's standpoint. And she says this not only provides oppression, but also provides literacy and skills for empowerment. If you look at writers or books like Walter Rodney's, what's it called? It's like the exploitation of Africa, or the why can't I remember this? De-development of Africa, or the book The Black Jacobins about the Haitian Revolution. They talk about how most people who start revolutions are from an oppressed group, but have been able to use social institutions by the dominant and to gain skills necessary and resources necessary for that revolution. So even though domination is enforced through the structural level, it also provides literacy and skills for empowerment. So again, she wants to show that the matrix of domination rarely has pure victims or pure oppressors, but everyone is located in dominant groups and subordinate groups at the same time. And that's why it's fundamentally not useful to talk about the additive form of oppression, where you say, here are all of my oppressions, this is how oppressed I am, because she's saying you can leverage some of your privilege in your oppressed areas, or vice versa. And so it's a really complex way of looking at power and identity and personal position. Okay, that's it for this week. Hopefully that helped clear things up about the matrix of domination. If you have any questions, I'm happy to talk about it. Please just email me, let me know. Otherwise, have a great week, and we'll talk to you soon.